Right, congratulations. Yeah. A breath. We're gonna have a conversation. It's gonna be great. All right. So you know the drill. We'll introduce ourselves. You can introduce yourself and the teacher, and then we're doing question 3. We'll read the question, then we're just gonna talk. It's gonna be great. So I'm gonna let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Beth Ratley. I'm from Wisconsin. I'm a former Weak People teacher, so I know what you're going through, all of you, very well. And right now I work for the American Institute for Research on Education Policy.
My name is Meg Hubeck. I work at the University of Virginia Center for Politics, where I'm the director of the Youth Leadership Initiative and a former teacher from Baltimore, Maryland.
I'm Mike Williams. I teach political science at the University of San Diego, and I'm an alum of the program. Please.
We're Unit 6 from Grant High School in Portland, Oregon. My name is Athena Wooters.
My name is Anjali Veerasinghe.
My name is Max Robin.
My name is Paige Suckling.
My name is Tate Butterfield. This is our teacher, Ms. Dee Pasquale, and we are very happy to be here.
All right. So I will read the question and we can get started. I didn't change the Constitution. The equality principle was there from the start. I just was an advocate for seeing its full realization. Do you agree with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg that the principle of equality was in the Constitution from the start? Why or why not? What role did the post-Civil War amendments play in helping to establish equality in the United States? What do you see as the biggest struggles in ensuring equality under the law in the 21st century?
We agree with Justice Ginsburg. From the beginning, equality existed as a principle in the Constitution, but expanding its definition is an ongoing struggle. The founding generation, influenced by Lockean natural rights ideas, endorsed a constitution stating that all men are created equal. Lincoln called this the great fundamental principle upon which our free institutions rest. The Constitution was ratified by we the people, granting protection through negative rights in Article 1, Section 9, and Article 4, Section 2, which prevented states from discriminating against citizens of other states. The Bill of Rights guaranteed enumerated rights to individuals and limited the national government's power.
However, the Constitution protected inequality through the 3/5 Clause and Fugitive Slave Clause. The Non-Importation Clause of Article 1, Section 9 protected slave importation until 1808. America was built on the systemic oppression of people of color, which contradicts our founding principles of freedom and equality. The Civil War amendments marked a second constitutional founding and broadened equality, but there was a struggle to effectively implement them. In 1865, the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation was fulfilled when the 13th Amendment ended slavery. However, through convict leasing, slavery by another name persisted.
The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection to all people, but the South resisted change through lynchings and increase in KKK power and a refusal to ratify the 14th Amendment. In 1870, the 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote. By the 1880s, an estimated 2,000 black men held public office as high as the US Senate. But by the 1890s, southern states enacted poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, while mob violence and organized hate groups prevented black people from voting. In 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson established the separate but equal doctrine, shattering the power of the 14th Amendment until the NAACP legal campaign revitalized its promise through Brown v. Board of Education 58 years later.
In the 21st century, the biggest struggles for equality under law are in voting rights and education. Since Shelby County v. Holder eviscerated the pre-clearance portion of the Voting Rights Act, state governments have imposed voter ID laws, eliminated same-day registration, and closed over 1,000 polling locations. To continue protecting equality, we should pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and reinstate the pre-clearance portion of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The struggle for equality under law is intensified by efforts to prevent the teaching of accurate history. Since 2021, 35 states introduced 137 bills limiting the teaching of race, history, sexual orientation, and gender identity.
To ensure equality under law, we must address the legacies of systemic oppression. Affirmative action is one important way to do so, but is under attack in the current Students for Fair Admissions cases. Justice Stewart, in his opinion in Jones v. Alfred Meyer, stated, "Congress has the power to pass all laws necessary and proper to abolish the badges and incidents of slavery. 3 U.S. cities have attempted reparations, but there have yet to be successful wide-scale payments to Black Americans." As Stacey Abrams said, "Progress is possible, but it is fragile, and across our country, the battles for our most basic human rights rage on." We are ready for your questions.
So you talked a lot about all these different examples and balancing and giving your evidence, but I want to know which has more impact in terms of reaching the equality principle. Is it litigation? Is it legislation? Is it advocacy? Which of all those different examples that you gave us, what has the most power?
I would argue that legislation has the most power when it comes to equality in our country, mainly on the premise that you cannot have equality in practice without having equality under law first.
I would argue advocacy because legislation is often built upon the efforts of protesters and advocates for equality around the country, and that advocacy can also influence the court's decisions.
We're in a place where nationally currently there isn't a ton of this de jure segregation, where a lot of the laws that in the past had been on the books creating segregation have been overturned, but that still means that we need to have these affirmative action type pieces of legislation to, in a sense, make right and make up for a ton of these centuries long past injustices.
And that's why advocacy right now in this moment is so important for ensuring that we have this expansive legislation that is going to protect voting rights, and especially minorities and people of color.
But I think that's an argument for the power of legislation, because though grassroots movements can raise awareness, legislation is the only comprehensive reparative action that can be taken to rectify these kinds of.
But let's go back to your education example. That's exact opposite of what you were just saying, right? So advocacy is turning legislation and going against the equality principle, because you want all of these different things taught and people are taking that out of the curriculum. So can it go the other way as well?
It definitely can go both ways, but throughout our history, this advocacy in favor of civil rights has been the leading force in moving our nation on this front.
Additionally, as the federal government holds no power specifically in schools to specifically alter curriculum, aside from a small amount of 7% of funding that is, or 7% of each state's education funding, it does rely on that state-by-state advocacy for comprehensive civic and media literacy education.
Is that where it should reside?
Where
In the state?
I believe that that we need to have that school boards are the main place where curriculum should be decided.
Local school boards or state school boards? And anybody can answer. You don't have to answer. Sorry. We're just having a conversation.
I think there's a huge risk with local school boards of the correct history not being taught because of popular opinion. So I think it's really important to have statewide standards for teaching accurate history, particularly our history of slavery and all of the events leading up to today. And I also think the national government can step in by using its leverage, using its money to ensure that accurate history is being taught.
I agree that the federal government can play a larger role in attaching funding to civics education, similarly as they did in No Child Left Behind with STEM education, which, although I disagree with it, it was successful in getting schools to promote STEM, science, math education. And so if we can connect funding to civics education programs, I think that we can incentivize local school boards to continue protecting the teaching of history.
And additionally, Minnesota, in their they had a proposed amendment to their state constitution that would grant a requirement that every single student has a fundamental right to an education that prepares them to live in our economy, our political world, and our society. And 74 UN nations already have this in their constitution. So if we granted this right to all students to have this education that prepares them for the world, that could be a first step.
So Tate, you mentioned that most of the segregation in this country is now de facto and not de jure. So what do you think can be done to promote more diversity in populations throughout the country instead of people kind of living in silos with like-minded people?
I think the biggest place we see silos, honestly, is online with, and that comes in much more important with people going down these rabbit holes of getting more and more extreme into their specific political ideologies, people who are more and more like them, which makes it so that people don't understand the people across the aisle. I think that's.
So what would you do, so what would y'all do about it?
I want to see a wider rollout of pre-clearance policies that expand beyond voting. A lot of legislation and social constructs like redlining and gerrymandering stem from or are supported by policy. And if there's oversight over these decisions, we can start to reverse this pattern of social segregation.
I also think putting more money into our public school system and trying to fight against the privatization of schools can be a huge factor in this. We saw after the Brown versus Board decision that white flight basically took education away from black children, and that public schools were shut down because there was no one to fund them, as every white parent sent their children to a private school that was closed off to black children. And this is something that we still see in our society today with private schools being increasingly wealthy, increasingly white, and so I think that refunding our public school system.
I think within our schools, having a requirement for some form of media literacy education. We saw that in Finland, they've got a requirement from kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade for media literacy classes. And according to Freedom House, they have the highest ranking of democratic productivity, largely thanks to that.
Similarly, affirmative action is critical to maintaining a diverse society. The state of California, following an initiative that banned affirmative action in public institutions, saw that in their next admissions year, the number of admitted black students at UCLA and UC Berkeley halved.
I want to ask you more about this idea that the principles of equality are actually in the founding document. Don't give me the Declaration of Independence. Where in the document, before the Reconstruction Amendments, do we find the principle of equality?
In Article 1, Section 9, elected officials are prohibited from having titles of nobility overseas, which I see as a principle of equality in that it kind of takes a step down from that aristocratic view.
I also see the lack of specific and detailed requirements to hold elected office as a principle of equality in the Constitution, because it allows for a wider swath of people to hold the offices that have power. And like the presidency, you only have to be 35 and a native-born citizen of the US. And so it allows for more people to be able to have power.
The first words of our Constitution were the people, though that obviously didn't include all the people when the Constitution was written. But that's what the definition has been expanded to be. And Lincoln thought that slavery wasn't a necessary evil that was in the Constitution, but was not necessarily inherent to the principle of equality.
It's that I want you to dig down into. It's like, we the people obviously didn't include. That's a pretty big giveaway, right? I mean, why don't we just start our story from Reconstruction? Why don't we just start the American story there? Why do we have to go back and pretend that there's some equality in the Constitution when I don't know if it's there or not?
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, along with Justice Brennan, believed in this idea of a living constitution, which is this theory that the aspects of dignity and equality and justice, though applied with a very narrow and frankly unequal scope at the time of the founding, have been and are meant to be expanded as the franchise grows and as our definition of equality grows. And that is why we have an amendment process, which was established at the founding.
Just one more follow. So it's growing from that we don't have titles of nobility? Like, what's it growing from? Like, what is in the document where we see this growth from?
I think that one specific section where the growth comes from, we mentioned before, is Article 4, Section 2's privileges and immunities guarantee, and especially after the ruling in Corfield v. Coriel clarified these as the fundamental rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of property that cannot be infringed. This goes back to this Lockean idea that we cannot be, infringing on each other's life, liberty, property.
Further, and though this wasn't in the founding document itself, it was part of the deal that created the founding document, and the Bill of Rights had rights enumerated to all persons in the United States, and that as the entity of persons has expanded over time, those rights have grown to cover more people.
Let's bring it up to current day. I love. Let me bring out my Federalist Papers. But let's bring it up to current day. What does full realization look like? You know, she talks about advocate for seeing full realization. What is it? What does it look like now?
I think that unrestricted and informed access to voting and ability and autonomy to vote is critical to achieving full equality, and that is something that we do not see today since the Shelby County v. Holder decision, and there are signs that it may be further infringed upon due to Bernabik v. DNC, and so I think that equal and unfettered access to voting.
I also think that equal access to opportunity and equal access to employment, especially when talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, something she was a huge proponent of. We see it in her dissent in the Ledbetter v. Goodyear case and the passage of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. I think that making sure that we are able to ensure everyone has the right to work and try and close wealth gaps in our nation is a way that we can start to move towards the full realization of equality.
I think additionally, as we move forward and new people are included under this "We the People," it's important that we have a framework for deciding how to bring them in and how to guarantee them rights. This is something that France has, where France has a specific board that kind of reviews, I guess, applications sort of from human rights groups that are advocating for certain rights in their groups. And I think that because the United States has so often in history been maybe 20 or even to a century, can I finish my thought? Behind ensuring rights for these groups, it's important that we can remain up to date.
If I had gotten to ask one more question, I would have asked about the Supreme Court and its kind of siding with states' rights over federal legislation. So it's just something for
Talk
you to
about that amongst
Yeah,
yourselves. Nice job, obviously. No, it gets uncomfortable, right? I mean, we were interrupting each other, we were interrupting you. That's because we're passionate, we just want to hear what you're thinking and to push your thinking. We're here to do that, as you are us, right? So we have certain things, we've talked about a lot of things, and then you bring up perspectives. That's a good thing. That's what we should be doing, right? Is having this natural conversation, and you did a really nice job with that in terms of giving evidence and really thinking about that and helping us think about it. So just know that that's why we're here. You gave me a lot of things that I'd love to talk to you about this evening. I want to talk about the internet. I wanted to push you on "We the People," like you started with. We got there in terms of you defining it, what that means, and you taking a risk, right? Saying where you thought it was in the Constitution, and us pushing back to say, well, let's think about this a little bit. That's what we should be doing. That's how we grow. And you did a really excellent job in working with us through these difficult concepts. So you should be very proud of what you did. And education, thank you for that. My world. So,
Oh, I'm sorry. Sometimes
she's just looking at the
I'm
notes.
really interested to hear about France and this guarantee of rights.
I love the international story. I love
I do.
that you guys took some of the international aspects of it.
That's cool. And the online silos that we get, and I was thinking more of like how we are tending to more as Americans live with people that we know, but thinking about being online with just people that you know is even worse. I don't know, maybe. I think so. Anyway, also the idea of reparations, and that's something I like to kind of hash out in a classroom, because what does that mean? What could that look like? It doesn't necessarily have to mean money in your pocket, but it could mean investments, places like that. But I think we're getting onto that thinking. And lots of historical references that were brought to the present with redlining. I come from the city where that is born, so yay. Not really. And then talking about local school boards and kind of the pressure on teachers right now. You did a great job. Very fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a really good conversation, and it we were able to have it because your opening statement showed that you clearly had thought about this. You knew the stuff, so that we could dig deeper and have you think about some things. So you're kind of the victim of, whatever is the last thing one of us have read. And so, but because you brought up accurate history a couple of times, right? Think about education, and there is an argument now floating around of like, why are we doing these movements to say that equality is there from the beginning? Why don't we just say equality is there from 1868, right? And then have that debate rather than have to go back to the founding, because as you found out, it's hard. And getting to privileges and immunities is great. Obviously that was for citizens,
Yeah.
right? And obviously we Dred Scott, right? We have so much of this that we have to confront. And these aren't just abstract historical debates. I think the story we tell ourselves as a nation is important. And just to bring it back to France really quick, after their revolution in 1789, in their Declaration of Rights of Man, they state, men are born and remain free in equal rights. That's a much different statement than even the 14th Amendment. It's a much different statement than the Declaration of Independence. So I would just encourage you to keep thinking about these things. I mean, this is a conversation that I wish I could have in college. It was really, really well done. So thank you very much.